Air Canada has pushed back numerous of its flight and has cut back on the number of flights that it will be operating for the next couple of months, as well as airport delays that have left many passengers unsure of what to do. Joining me now to discuss some of that and much more is Duncan D, who is the former Chief Operating Officer at Air Canada. Duncan, thanks so much for making the time. Let's start out with the first piece that I mentioned in the introduction of Air Canada cutting back on the number of flights that it will be operating for the coming months. What does that mean for passengers who had flights booked, and many of them, and in many of their cases, had flights booked for important travels and for important reasons that they will now not be able to do?
Well, clearly for those travelers that are impacted, it'll be quite disappointing. They will be left scrambling to try to accommodate their travel aboard new flights. Air Canada will be working with a lot of these travelers. They won't obviously be able to take care of every single one of them. But the flights that Air Canada decided to cancel are flights which also have some alternatives. For example, they canceled Montreal to Baltimore Washington International Airport. There are two other airports in the Washington area, so my anticipation will be that Air Canada will offer travelers affected on that route other alternatives within the Washington area. And if you take a look at the other flights that they canceled, they were generally time of day flights, so they last flight of the day, so travelers would have alternatives, hopefully, to be able to continue with their travel. For those who can't be accommodated, they will obviously be entitled to refunds, and I would expect that Air Canada would process those for those travelers.
And all of this kind of comes in the midst of airport delays in general. If you go to, say, Pearson Airport right now, a lot of people, reporters are there on the ground almost all the time now, covering it just based off of how long some of the wait times are at the airport. To what extent was that part of the reason that Air Canada has cut back on some of their flights, and what are some of the other reasons that may have played into that decision?
Well, Wyatt, I think you're absolutely right. This is not a new problem that we've faced in Canada. The first time I personally saw huge lineups at the airport was on the 2nd of April, a Saturday morning in April at Pearson, where they had upwards of a 2 and 3 hour security line. Those are lines which should not be happening, should not be seen at any Canadian airport in the month of April or even in the month of May, which are not particularly heavy travel months. So these things have been building for quite some time now. Today is the 89th day where we've seen delays at airport security and at customs and immigration. And so Air Canada has had to deal with this. And that's why they needed to trim their schedule to allow themselves the opportunity to deliver on the customer service and the schedule that they hope for the rest of the summer.
And to what extent can the government help with this? And is there anything that the government can do realistically that would actually make a meaningful difference in, the lives of travelers as they depart for wherever they're trying to go?
No, when you look at what has been happening, the government was warned that this was going to be happening about 3 months ago, and they've done very, very little. They've so-called fixed the security lineups by forcing travelers to check in 3 hours before their flight, which is something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. Instead of dropping the ArriveCan app, for example, which has been a huge problem, according to the border city mayors, the Custom and Immigration Officers Union, airports and airlines, instead of dropping that app, they said that they're now going to continue it indefinitely. So the government really hasn't done much to help the airlines and travelers avoid the huge, huge inconveniences that we've seen at airports for the last 3 months.
And then just lastly, obviously, these travelers are, as I mentioned in my first question, they're in many cases going on trips that can't be rescheduled with time sensitive things that they are traveling for. Is there anything realistically that the airline can do on its side to improve this?
Well, certainly Air Canada will be working with their customers to the extent that they can reprotect them on different flights. Like I mentioned earlier, there could be alternatives. Obviously, not everyone is going to be able to be reaccommodated. And so Air Canada will have to work with those travelers in terms of getting them refunds or even helping them find alternate arrangements. But at the end of the day, the reason why an airline like Air Canada would make this decision was to allow it the opportunity to have a relatively better summer peak than what would have otherwise taken place. What they have done by trimming the number of flights is try to reduce the number of flights during the peak period and, you know, allow travelers a much more normal experience than what they've been used to over the last little while.
Okay, Duncan D, former Chief Operating Officer of Air Canada. Thanks so much, Duncan, for making the time and for explaining some of these recent events that have been happening at airports across Canada. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Wyatt.